Welcome to the AI Decision Guy podcast, the show where we explore the intriguing balance between artificial intelligence and human decision-making. I'm your host, Dr. Carlos Kemeny, and in each episode, we dive deep into the world of AI and its impact on various industries. Joe Reis is the best-selling co-author of Fundamentals of Data Engineering, published by O'Reilly. He is a recovering data scientist and the co-founder and CEO of Ternary Data. He's a business-minded data nerd who's worked in the data industry for over 20 years. He hosts the popular data show, the Monday Morning Data Chat, interviewing the top professionals in the data field, as well as recently launched the Joe Reis Show, Nerdy Rants. Joe runs several meetups, including the Utah Data Engineering Meetup and SLC Python, as well as teaches at the University of Utah. He's a good friend, and I'm grateful for him joining the show today. Okay, well, it's wonderful to have a good friend of mine, Joe. Joe, thanks for joining the show.
What's happening? How you doing?
Good. I think that your fame across the world continues to grow. You're going to be going on tour here soon.
Yeah, I start tour next week. I'm going to Atlanta for the Joe Reis and DBT Roadshow. Then I think the following week off to Australia, doing a couple talks in Utah, surprisingly enough. So I think next Tuesday at the data engineering, or not data engineering leadership, something or other. Yeah, then UDEM, the meetup I helped start, speaking at that one. So then it's the last time I'll be in Utah speaking for probably quite a while. So
well, like
to be in front of a home crowd for a bit. But yeah.
Speak to that a little bit. I mean, obviously the book has gained quite a bit of traction over what now has been 2 years now.
It's been just a bit over a year.
A year. And so, I mean, clearly on my LinkedIn feed, I continue to see people raving about the book, holding the book up. And this shows the impact. I mean, you guys have really written something that has won some hearts and some minds. And so how's that been?
It's a trip to see it, you know. I mean, I still think it's pretty surreal, you know, especially when people write blog posts about it and, you know, take the time to review it, because that's a lot of time to write a post really about a book. I mean, that's kind of crazy. So to see people, you know, either posting about it with pictures, I mean, that happens on I would say multiple times a day now. It's really interesting to see. So, you know, I'm definitely grateful to everybody out there, you know, so it's one of the things that I think on one hand, you sort of get used to it. On the other hand, you shouldn't get used to it because then you start taking it for granted. Yeah. So, but it's cool seeing it, you know, and I think traveling the world and, you know, meeting people who have read the book and getting to know, you know, what they've, you know, what they like about it and sometimes what they don't, you know, and being mobbed and taking selfies and signing autographs is definitely, it's a change from what I used to do. So, but it's fun. It's a lot of fun. So.
Well, talk about why you think this was such a hit. I mean, obviously, one of the challenges of data has been creating some kind of standardization around structure that organizations can adopt. And so for me, when I look at that book, I think one of the great values of this is actually getting practice combined with just experience, you know, all of this in one, where it starts to put some of these thoughts and ideas that a lot of people have been thinking about into a book and into a structure. And I think there's a convergence that people have wanted for quite some time that you guys achieved. Is that part of this?
I think that it's because data engineering is, I think a lot of it, because it's seen as a necessity, right? And people want to learn it. And it's really hard, I think, to get the right materials. I mean, now it's getting a lot easier. You know, I got a lot of friends making courses and writing books on that. You know, the most popular book in O'Reilly still is Martin Kleppman's Designing Data Intensive Applications, right? So that book's been out since I think 2017 or maybe even earlier, but you know, that's a book on distributed systems. It was actually geared towards software engineers. It wasn't geared towards quote data engineers because that was just I think a budding title at that point. But that, you know, I think so. It speaks to the testament that there's a big interest in data engineering if that's the most popular book, right? You know, and I think by a long shot, it's the most popular book in O'Reilly. I think ours will, you know, by most estimations, eventually catch up with it. But I think ours is one of the top O'Reilly books as well. So it's But I think it more speaks to where the industry is, right? So if designing data intensive applications is a big hit, and that's a distributed systems book, which I think is a great book. I've read it several times, but it's also very deep, right? It doesn't, it throws you into the deep end quite quickly. So I think what we wanted to do with the fundamentals of data engineering was really take a step back and write the prequel to designing data intensive applications with probably a bit more of a, somewhat of a modern take, but I also, we take the approach that Martin did with his book where we focus on the immutables as well, because that's, I think provides the necessary framework for people interested in data engineering to really wrap their heads around data engineering. Because I think there's a lot of really, I wouldn't say bad materials, but I think maybe materials that won't set you up for success as much, where, if it's, say, data engineering on like AWS or data engineering with Python, for example, those books I think are good, but I don't think they give you the broader context of what data engineering is as a discipline. And so that was the thing I think that was most lacking in the field, was just, contextualizing and defining the field, for lack of a better way of putting it. So, but I think we managed to at least give our perspective on what we think data engineering is and where it fits into the universe. And I think it just resonated with enough people around the world that it blew up. It was interesting too on Amazon. It was, it was number one new release like several months before it came out. So we already knew that it was going to be a hit. So,
well, congratulations.
That was interesting.
I mean, obviously it's a big deal. And yeah. I think that, part of the conversation that you've been having, because you have a show that you've been doing now you did kind of the morning chat, which I love. There's kind of just that, raw conversation for quite some time. And now you have a show that you've launched that you're talking to some incredible people and bringing folks in. Maybe talk a little bit about the things that you're most passionate about right now. What are the things that, you've been talking about data modeling for some time. You've talked about quality, but what's on top of mind now for you?
I think the same things. Data modeling still top of mind. I would say finding different, so that's what's driving that discussion really is I think that it's just total anarchy in the way we think about data right now, right? And I'm not just talking about data proper, like data engineers or analysts. I think that that's the stuff they have to deal with is more of a consequence of upstream, bad behaviors or maybe a lack of appreciation of data modeling. And so something I've just been thinking a lot about, like how do we get back to basics with data, right? Because especially with the surge of AI, for example, I think we're at a point where there's going to be a lot of attention focused on AI and data. But if the underlying data sources are kind of crappy, or substandard, then what do you think is going to happen? If you throw a large language model on top of a database that's probably not great, I think you're going to get not great results. And so, but I'm really optimistic on AI, for example, right? And I really think that this is the moment that the industry can really shine. But AI could allow us to do a lot of dumb things more quickly or more incorrectly. And so that's one thing I've been thinking about. But I was thinking about, data modeling before, I think the popularity of ChatGPT when that came out last November. I've been toying around with this idea because I felt like that was the thing that was missing in my book. Fundamentals of Data Engineering was really the discussion on data modeling felt we did it justice to expose people to it. But I really feel like as I saw data teams and software teams working with, just data, whether it's in a transactional database or whatever, it was just sort of, manhandled, for lack of a better way of putting it. You just throw the data in and do what you can, but there's no rhyme or reason to it. I saw this a lot in my consulting gigs. The data is just kind of, it could be better, right? And so as I started digging into the root causes of this, I figured that data modeling was chief among the root causes of a lot of the problems that we see, which is poor data quality and, the reason you need observability, for example, is, schema changes. Well, why did the schema change? Well, was the schema changed in a way that it actually makes any sense at all, too? That's the other question. Right, so just things like this. That's what's been on my mind. I think the other things that are on my mind right now is, just teaching, right? Better ways of teaching. So I'm working on some courses on data engineering right now. You'll find out more about those pretty soon. One's on probably the world's largest MOOC, to give you an example. So just projects like that, and then also what's in store for next year. I don't know. I have a lot of things in my mind. Part of me is wondering if I want to take a step back from the data world in general and just kind of focus on other stuff, which I've been thinking about. I've been thinking about the impact of social media on kids and AI on kids, and I really feel like that might be the next phase that I go into, but I'm not sure yet. Maybe I'll stay doing what I'm doing. This industry finds a way of keeping you sucked in. So
let's dig into a few of the things that you just talked about, because you talked about a number
there were
of
a few
themes.
of them.
So clearly, I want to hit on the AI and social media. I want to hit on all of these things because I also share a passion there on the decision-making side. But let's talk first. Let's rewind a little bit to the data quality, because I've seen the same things. I think that in consulting, Fortune 250 startups alike, I found the same thing to be true, which is a lot of people don't have a handle on their data quality. A lot of this is that you put people on it, you say, hey, get it done. And then there's some data flow, there's a pipeline somewhere, and then there's a data set, and now you start going crazy on dashboards. And this is the point at which executives feel like you have a handle on things. There's not a lot of observability towards data quality. Why is this continuing to be a problem? And two, when is it going to shift? I'm already starting to see the waves of change. Part of this is driven by OpenAI and hallucinations. I love this conversation. I love the media posts right now around hallucinations, because it points finally to something that people can tangibly feel about when something's wrong. They can see that an input is now leading to something that's unexpected, where they expected something to be perfect. And this is actually helping, I think, the data quality story be told quite a bit before our eyes. There is clearly a message that we've told for decades now: data with quality in, quality out, or garbage in, garbage out. But I think this is the first moment that people are feeling that, wait, this is pretty true. And I think it was recognized before, in that a CEO doesn't trust the dashboard or whatever is shown on some data story, and leans over to a CFO or whoever he trusts or she trusts in that room. And that's when they just basically go around anything that's shown on a dashboard. And this happens quite often. And a lot of this is the irreversibility of trust when something's presented and it's incorrect, or just the misunderstanding that data changes, models change. And so you have to be very deliberate about how not only that you structure and architect all of these things, but also how you present. And here's the other piece. I think data science and data in general, we're too honest, unfortunately. And this is, look, integrity is above all else, right? But when and I've done this, I've been in this position where you learn something new, you add something and you say, hey, some of the results have changed, and I want to make sure you know that. This undermines, I think, the biggest piece of what data is meant to do. It's meant to reduce uncertainty. If data is there to action on and to create decisions, right, all of that, then really what we're driving at is that it should reduce uncertainty more than what the uncertainty level was before. And when we start incrementally introducing uncertainty, then it almost feels like there's a net zero or an increasing uncertainty to the decision maker. Why don't you comment on some of these things?
There's a lot to unpack there. I mean, trust has always been a big thing, right? I mean, it's always bring up Bill Inman. When I asked him his true north one time, he said it was about making sure data is believable, and adds value. I still think that's true, but he had this realization decades ago. But that's always been his true north, right? So data needs to be believable and add value. But believable is an interesting thing, because it's also I brought this up at a talk I did in Canada a couple months ago, and it was funny because somebody's like, "Well, believable data, like that could also mean it's wrong." I'm like, "Yeah, but that's sort of the point, isn't it? Right? How do you know it's right?" Either, right? But I think if it helps facilitate a decision that is value add, I think that's maybe the better impact, right? Because we can hair split all day about right or wrong. I mean, we can hair split all day about rational and irrational numbers, for example. Which one is correct? I don't know. How far do you want to round out? Which one is more right? What's the right version of pi, for example? Right? I don't know. Depends on what kind of answer do you want. What kind of decision do you plan to make, or what kind of action is going to, you want to result from that? And so I think that's maybe a better way of thinking about the uncertainty aspect is. And so the brutal honesty you point out is interesting. I think there's definitely some aspect of that. What I wish would be trained in data science and just I think it's like stakeholder management and working with the business a bit more closely and a bit more tightly. That's one thing I'm for my course I'm building. Actually, the first part of it is it's actually requirements gathering. As a data engineer, for example, and guess what you're doing all the time? You're not sitting there building Spark pipelines. Typically, you're actually talking to stakeholders and understanding what they want and diving into the questions behind the questions and the the reasons behind the reasons and so forth. And I think that's something where I think if we get better align with stakeholders, I think that the amount of uncertainty that we have in the process of creating data sets, for example, I think that's largely reduced. I think the big fundamental problem we have is, there's kind of data over here, data meaning the teams, and there's business over here. And I really think that wall needs to be, probably broken down a bit. I had an article, it was back in, was it April or I think it was April. I was walking around Geneva. Just did a quick video of me just talking about the business doesn't care about data, right? Quote data. So you need to talk about things in terms of the vocabulary that the business understands, not just talk about things that you understand because they really don't care. If I came to you and started talking about, I don't know, businessy things that you didn't care about, inventory turns and stuff, right? Or something like that. I don't know. Pick your example. You had no knowledge of what this was. You just look at me like I'm crazy, right? But this is what data people do all the time. And I think this adds to the uncertainty aspect that you're talking about because that's kind of why executives at the end of the day, they just sort of circumvent the data team in general and just start, kind of doing their own thing. I was actually just talking to somebody about this about an hour ago. So, a big person in the data field. I won't name names, but we're just kind of talking about how it's interesting too. We've built these massive systems like, the modern data stack, which I think does have some value in the right context, but it's interesting now that the decision making that we used to do back in the day, 20 years ago, just using spreadsheets and just discussions. Now we have to have a data warehouse for that and, a BI tool. And I firmly believe that we don't need, most companies don't actually need any of that stuff. It's like, you need to have good conversations. And I think and good analytical chops. So you can use spreadsheets for a lot of that stuff, to be frank. I don't think you need stuff fancy. This is probably going to piss off all my friends that work at these companies, but but that's my take on it. I think that keeping things low fidelity is actually, I think, a better thing because it reduces the time to decisions in most cases, right? You can get fancy later, but I think that the main thing is you want to have the muscle memory and the routine for making decisions. And if you can get that, then everything else falls into place. If you don't have that, no amount of fancy technology in the world is going to help you. So,
see, this goes to my.
That's a weird way to answer your question, or not, or I guess not answer your question. But there you go.
It's answered. I think that you've answered it. I mean, obviously, I think a lot of the tools that exist and all of this data in the sprawl that's existed has created noise. And I think that just taking what you said, it's a lot of noise. There's a lot of periphery. And if decisions, I hate the phrase data-driven decision making.
Yeah.
I feel like this is a very consulting type phrase that we should do away with in the lexicon of data because.
Why does it bug you?
It bugs me because we process billions of information, data points every single, minute, and so we're clearly data driven. So there's an oxymoron-esque feel to this where there's a bit of arrogance that we as maybe data people take that the data that you should be processing is my data, not everything else around you. And as a decision scientist, the reason why this bugs me is let's look at how people make decisions instead of the unnatural, which is I'm going to give you data. Now break the world apart and just look at the stuff I give you and make a decision off of that or else I'm going to be upset. Whereas a decision scientist would look at this and say, how does somebody make decisions? And now let's back into what portion. If you're being a true data scientist, you're figuring out what drives the decision. 98% of the decisions you made, Joe, today, or 99.9 have nothing to do with the dashboard. And it goes to your point, like most of your decisions are based on history, It's going to be DNA. There's going to be, right. There's going to be different factors, conversations, but we, for whatever reason, think that the driver of decisions often is a dashboard is kind of a misguided approach. And I think it's a bit arrogant and it really hurts us.
I think so. And I mean, it's a classic hammer and nail situation, right? And so data-driven decision-making is definitely, I do agree. I think it's, because everyone's like, oh, show me the data. And I'm like, well, sometimes you have to be able to operate in a low information environment. That's most business, actually. Most business, it's like you can drive with the rear view mirror and try and predict forward. I've done enough forecasting in my life. I know how this works. It works until it doesn't, right? And it works until you have some exogenous effect or endogenous effect that it causes you to all your assumptions to go out the window. I remember one time I got hired at an e-commerce company, and was it August of 2008 as a forecaster. I was there to forecast and help implement a new forecasting system there. And then I'm sure you remember what happened. September 2008, the entire floor of the economy fell out. So all your forecasting just went out the window. So all you could do, I mean, so if you're trying to do classic time series forecasting, you're dead in the water, right? Seasonal components still might work to some extent, like you're not going to buy winter jackets in the summer and so forth. But the trends, that changes. The magnitude, that certainly changes. So at that point, you do have to operate in a low information environment, right? You're having to, I think, try and look for more forward-looking indicators of customer behavior. So one thing I did is I was looking at web traffic, which back then people weren't looking at. This is kind of the mid-late 2000s, and the classic time series forecasting is still the vogue. But I'm like, what's customer behavior telling us at this point? And also just kind of looking around and just anecdotally just seeing, okay, so gosh, people don't seem to have any money anymore. This is a weird thing. I guess they won't be buying things that are probably considered it's not a necessity, right? So, I mean, you remember that time. That was gnarly. I mean, that was a scary, scary time. It's hard for the audience to understand. I mean, it's kind of like what happened during, in March and COVID, but I would say the consequences were actually much more real. You were looking at, potentially a very, very looming Great Depression if things hadn't changed, and thankfully it did. But, so again, you can try and be as data driven as you want, given the tools at your disposal. But I think you do need to understand the limitations of those tools and when it's time to change approaches too. And that sometimes means you're operating off your gut, God forbid. I mean, when you're driving your car, for example, I mean, a lot of that's gut driven decision making. I mean,
absolutely. This is very complex. There's a lot of consequences around what you do and the decisions you make there, right? Of course there are. I think that when you talk about the stakeholder and the power, I think of a data expert that is talking about the scope, this also has a lot of consequence on the quality of the output and how you determine the decision. I think you brought up that post. I remember that post when you were walking around Switzerland. I remember that because it was it Geneva? So I don't remember exactly, but it was
Geneva. Yep.
Yeah. So I was sitting there and I was thinking, yeah, I mean, like clearly this is, very valuable because at the end of the day, if somebody thinks that they want something and you go through that, there needs to be a framework by which you guide people to an output that is going to influence their decision instead of going through a lot of work. And this happened yesterday. I was talking to somebody and we were talking about a problem that they're trying to solve. And it started here. And we ended up, well, what's the problem really that you're trying to solve? And digging into data availability, data quality, talking about the actions that are going to be affected. And this framework is a framework that I often use. And we ended up saying, well, isn't this really the problem that you're trying to solve? And it completely changes the solution that you're approaching. And because of that, you're getting rid of a lot of periphery. And so when you talk about better scoping, better business requirement documentation, this is a fundamental piece of data quality, right?
Oh, yeah. That's really interesting. I mean, walk me through that process of how did you arrive at, I guess the answer that seemed probably far off in the distance, right? Or it was seemingly not the topic of discussion when you started your discussion.
A lot of this was driven around these factors, right? So it's almost like a formula. I think that when you're talking about this, there's a input output equation, and a lot of it is driven around prioritization. Actually, this is my opinion. I'd love to hear your thoughts about these inputs. But if, for example, you have low data availability and there's a lot of collection, but the data quality is unknown, this is probably not something you're going to be prioritizing. Whereas if you have high data availability and high resolution quality or high integrity, but maybe there's some gaps in that integrity, you need to establish whether that's critical integrity to solve or not. Right. And I think what we end up doing is a lot of people will just say, oh, I need to get data very high resolution, or they don't even think about it. Data availability is whatever data I have. We're going to kind of force fit the situation. No, there's some inputs here. And then I think that a lot of the business requirements are driven around action and around the effect that you want. Are you automating something, or are you creating a better decision? And that actually puts you in different frameworks as well. What are your thoughts? Do you agree, disagree with those inputs?
No, I certainly agree. I think there's the answer you think you're going to get, and there's the answer that you get, right? These are sometimes not the same things. I've always been a big fan of like 5 whys, for example, to really dig into, like data availability and quality, for example. Like why is a data available but of low quality, or vice versa, right? And you keep digging into that. And oftentimes you'll arrive at different conclusions. Maybe you hit it right on the head, but I think, but it helps, I think, challenge assumptions in a slightly annoying way, but I think a very good way. So root cause analysis is always something that I think people should try and practice, right? But I guess, you have to, I think, balance that against what's the agenda of the person asking the question. Sometimes they don't want to know the root cause.
You just want an answer.
You want an answer, but you want the answer that you want.
Yeah.
Not the answer that you might get, right? Because I mean, again, it depends on what your agenda is. If you get the answer, if the correct answer is the one that doesn't meet your agenda, then I guess there's a bit of a predicament here, isn't there? So this happens a lot, and I think it's something that data people, I think, need to be keenly aware of. Is as you kind of pointed out the other time, it's sometimes the data doesn't confirm things, and executives might want to take a different approach, and so that's just kind of how it is. As I wrote about this last week in my newsletter, what was it called, The Politics of Data. So I walked with my good friend Aaron Hunziker. I don't know if you know him in Salt Lake. He's a really good dude. And he's just mentioning we're talking about just buying software, buying systems, and it's like the decision's already been made. Like you can go through all these mechanics and stuff, but it's like at the end of the day, it's just, so there's a lot of politics, right? And I think that's sort of, that does drive these sorts of answers, I think, that people end up using. This is not the same thing as the answers that the data team ends up providing, mind you. But you've been around the block enough to know that sometimes, people have other reasons. So
Jacob Miller over at Pattern, so he's incredibly intelligent, a great guy. And he put a napkin in front of me and he said, hey, this is what I present to my stakeholders. And it's basically a decision branch. If you look at a decision tree, and it basically says, hey, if, what do you think is going to, what do you think the output's going to be? Like, what's the answer that you anticipate? And he puts X where the answer is going to be, right? And then he draws and says, if we do this project and we get Y, what's the probability that you would actually do Y instead of X? Or are you going to do X anyway? Like, and I think this is a great visualization for every single person who's scoping, is to understand that like your work, and it's just like the big 5, right? With like consulting, they get paid a lot of money to validate things that people want them to validate in a deck, right? And I think you're really wise in suggesting what you're suggesting, which is just, this is the reality of life, folks. Like, don't fight against it. And in fact, this may merit pushing it to a team or distributing across your team these tasks that are just validation tasks. But it's really important to know what you're doing. If you go one direction and you think that you're actually going to influence this to Y instead of X, then you're going to be frustrated and your timeline at that company may be less and less. Whereas if you recognize that the answer needs to be X and that's what people want to validate and that's what it's used for, there's a moral, I think sometimes we fight this moral battle. And I've actually paid the price for fighting the moral battle. And really, unfortunately, as a cost center, most of the time, data is viewed as a cost center.
Yep.
The reality is you're just delivering whatever they want, right?
Mm-hmm. Yep. Yeah. That's the reality of it. Yeah, I like the way you put it. Sometimes the reality is just delivering what people want. And again, this goes back to the believable part of the what Bill Inman said about believable data. It's so it's not, it may not be correct, but it's what's believable, and so it's interesting, right? Because I again, I just wish this stuff would be taught sooner. For people, it'd probably save you a lot of headache. You probably, it might save you a whole career worth of mistakes, or it might just mean like you just switch careers because this is probably not a good fit for you. There's,
Yeah.
I've known nothing except this sort of industry and working in it, so it is what it is. But
well, let's talk about
a veterinarian or something. I don't know.
Yeah, clearly you could do that. Let's talk about AI and the complications that AI, and then we'll shift over towards the end of this, like towards social media. I want to hit on that, but I think AI, there's a great danger of AI, and I'm not going to go into the whole end of the world thing. I think the greater danger is, again, the wrong data based on poor data quality and not having observability into that. I think this is kind of well discussed in various channels right now, but this is concerning because of default adopt mentality towards technology. That's what I think. I think a root cause here is that. But what do you do if a model's not observable, if there's not transparency, there's not an understanding of what the output's going to be before you start putting it in, and data quality is not being observed as well? How do you solve for this problem? Both the input is uncertain in terms of quality and the output's uncertain because of quality. What do you do? And clearly the answer, I think, is, well, you clean up the inputs, you build a process around data quality in the inputs, and then you observe the outputs, right? But I think that, like, why have we not done this yet with analytics? I did a survey on companies and I asked, how much do you trust your data right now? And tech companies are saying 2.4 out of 10 is the average, right? Like, it's horrible. And that's just on analytics. That's not even on AI. And so how does AI hurt this? How does that play into this? And what's the future of AI if people don't trust anything?
I mean, you could take one thread and say that AI will solve the problem in ways that we can't. And I guess it's always possible that it could. I'm not going to dismiss that. But I've done enough machine learning to know that inputs sort of dictate your outputs to some degree. There's obviously a level of stochastic rigmarole, especially when you're dealing with deep learning, because it's literally how it works. But it's almost machine learning works as well. So it's not deterministic. It's the whole point of it, right? You have to build a model. And so, yeah, I don't know. I mean, it's one of those things where I guess if you don't trust the inputs, you don't trust the outputs, I guess you'll need to assess the impact, right? And so maybe you have a null hypothesis of what the impact's going to be. And then I guess you assess what the impact is actually going to, what it does. And so I guess it's maybe the approach I would take. Because again, as long as the output's like somewhat believable, I guess maybe that's, if you use ChatGPT, I mean, it does a pretty good job on a lot of stuff. I don't know, but would I use that for BI? I don't know. Here's the deal too. If you give it the same data set, it'll still come up with different answers depending on what happens. So, I think you just need to kind of understand what you're dealing with, But yeah, if we can't get BI right, I mean, throwing AI on top of that, I think is a recipe for disaster. But that's the road we're going down, whether we like it or not. So that's, every company right now, I think, has some sort of mandate to figure out AI and implement it. And there's certain ways it would work. I think for like customer service data, for example, right, where you're, or I saw one where it was like was it Hardee's, Wall Street Journal? Some lady went through the Hardee's drive-thru like 30 different times because they have a new automated bot there that takes your order. And she said 28 out of 30, it did a great job, actually, which I think is still better than half the time I go to a fast food drive-thru where they mess up my order like every single time. So, it's, I mean, so I think it just depends on the use case too. I think for things like that, especially where I think you have unstructured data, I think that's actually where it has more potential, which has always been the case for machine learning. It does the unstructured data problems, I think, are just, allow you to do things at scale, and operate at a scale that you couldn't do with humans, like image recognition and so forth. And generative AI, I think that it just makes all the unstructured use cases way clearer. I think that's why you see ChatGPT doing really well in text, because it's like it just does. It does a phenomenal job. Midjourney does great on images, and so forth. So I think but when you start trying to apply this to structured data, I think this is where the predicament starts happening, right? I mean, but I saw this in machine learning several times over a decade now. So, been working on these types of problems. I just think structured data, tabular data, is very difficult to work with, right? There's not. It's really hard to glean like a coherent set of patterns out of that. For text, for example, right? When you talk about like transformer models, there are ways that it works, I would say, in a fairly standardized fashion. But with structured data, it's a lot different, because every column is different. Every column is its own adventure, and so it's just fundamentally a different type of problem to solve. But I think we're trying to use this blunt instrument and say, well, obviously it'll work on your transactional database, your data warehouse, just the same. And I'm like, I don't know. I mean, maybe it will, maybe it won't. But again, trying to do that with human-aided stuff like BI, still having a hard time doing that. So I think back to your point, yeah, remains to be seen.
I'm curious, what is the relationship between when you put a lot of energy, so let's say labor input or whatever, into a structured data set, there is an expected level of quality, right? And now with unstructured, there's no level of effort potentially, right? There's some, right, for the infrastructure, but it's collecting a bunch of data. Is this just basically look, there's an expectation of quality for structured versus unstructured, and we are very forgiving when it's a creative process. For example, with Midjourney, like that takes a lot of time and effort. I haven't done anything to structured data. I'm just putting a sentence, and now it's outputting an image. And I say there's a relationship there of maybe that the quality is completely something that we're in awe about because we haven't done any effort. And yet at the supervised level or structured level, you have data that you have put effort in. There's an expectation of quality on the output. And therefore, psychologically, we say, oh, the output better have a more narrow band of error.
I think there's a lot of truth to that. Yeah. Mm-hmm. I mean, images are an interesting example, right? Or video. So I was talking to my friend Will Rojas. He's over at Coactive. So they do a lot of unstructured data stuff over there. And he's talking to me a bit about basically how do you structure a database to keep track of all the outputs of these models, right? So we got back to the notion of granularity and unstructured data, which is a very fascinating topic to think about. So what is it that you're trying to detect at the end of the day, right? In an image, like what's the grain of the decision or the objects or object that you're trying to identify? It's actually a really subtle problem, but I think a very important problem to talk about, right? So I think I'm trying to get him out to Utah to talk about this. One of the meetups, it's definitely one of the more forward-looking conversations through respect to sort of bridging that gap between unstructured and structured data. But structured data in itself, I think, is just, as I think about through the context of data modeling, right? It's just you're trying to capture reality, and the business processes and rules in a way that you can, store and retrieve in a database. Right. But if you start at the conceptual level, that has nothing to do with the database. It's just simply understanding the flow of information. It's a fundamentally different type of a problem than reading a bunch of text. Right. You're trying to, it's part process, mapping and engineering when you're doing conceptual data modeling as well. Then if you want to continue, you can do logical and physical modeling. I think all too often what I see nowadays is people start at physical data modeling, though. They just say, well, because I have a database, I could throw a ton of compute at it. What do I need to model anything for? I'll sort into one giant table, and that's that. And I think it's an approach. I would say that you're trading off efficiency for fidelity of your data. You don't really understand what's going on with it, I can guarantee you. Not as much as you would if you went through the exercise of understanding the flow of data and how it works and how it relates to your business. But
I'd be in favor of doing away with the Indiana Jones effect of data. Like,
What does that mean?
The golden nugget. I mean, they're there for the art, for the golden, the crystal skull, which was, we all know how that landed. But I think that, but there's this, I'm in it for the discovery of something I don't know, right? Like, how actionable is that anyway? Like, but there's something about, I saw my wife showed me an app that I think is the most brilliant app that I've seen using image detection and everything. It's from Bricket. And what it does is you take a picture of a bunch of Legos that are randomly sitting on the ground, and it recognizes each of the different shapes in the Legos, and then it gives you 10 different things that you can build with the instructions.
That's cool.
Like, I think this demonstrates exactly, an objective function that's very, very scoped. It's well scoped. I have an objective. I have an action that I have for this. I'm going to build an application that recognizes in that context. So the anticipation is somebody's not going to go take a selfie and then do this, right? Like, there's a context. And with that context, now there's like a data set that's built with instructions and with, different blocks. It's a brilliant demonstration of this point.
Oh, that's genius. That's cool. I saw something similar to the Rubiks Cube. You can take a picture of a Rubik's Cube and it would give you a way to solve it. Not that I suggest people do it. You should try and solve it yourself. But that's really cool. And again, I think these are unstructured data problems, though, right? And I think this is like the power of, just these technologies. And that's what I'm pretty excited about, But I think that the problems that you run into with structured data, I don't know. I mean, we've been talking about that stuff for decades, and I don't think we're still any closer to the solution. I think in a lot of cases, the solution isn't technical, at least not yet. Obviously, you can maybe train an AI to do this stuff at some point. I fully expect that's going to happen. But I was talking again with somebody about this today. I really feel like the biggest gap we have in the industry right now, the data industry that is it's just knowledge and practices. We're really good at using tools. I think we're really boneheaded in the way that we go about using the ingredients, i.e. data, right? This isn't the same as a tool. Tools are just a data warehouse or something. That's just a mechanism, right? But again, that's not the same thing as understanding the craft, understanding, but to make a comparison, it's like being a chef, having a great oven, having great knives and so forth and whatever else. But you don't know how to mix ingredients together. You don't understand ingredients. Like what's a flavor profile, right? You don't understand any of that stuff. You just throw things together, put it in your very nice oven, and then that's that, right? And I feel like that's a lot of data practices these days. We're super good at the tools. We suck at actually doing our job.
Isn't this manifest in your experience when a big company, and I've seen this in various companies, not just big but small too, that the solution to this is just switching tools. They kind of believe that, my BI tool's not the right tools, so I'll switch over to Looker, or I'll look over, and you're like, that's the biggest farce. Like, there's not any type of reality to that. It's the people, it's the process, it's the framework, right?
Mm-hmm. It is, but you only get to this point of being curmudgeon and talking about these things after you've been slapped in the face a number of times too. And I think it takes a long time, I think, to develop this, sense of, I don't know, jadedness to some degree about things. But, because the tool is the easy part, and every vendor in the world is going to obviously tell you that their tool is the only way to solve a problem. And if you're not using it, you're basically human garbage and so forth. I've had vendors say that too. I've had vendors tell me, like, if you don't choose our tool, like, you should be fired. The client shouldn't have you. To which point I just sort of threw up my middle finger and told them, kind of what I thought about that idea. And I think that's just the attitude, right? And so we live in a very tool-centric world. And again, tools are great. They accentuate, and amplify, great practices. I think they also amplify really horrible practices. So, it's, and when we talk about garbage in and garbage out with data, right, and quality and so forth, I really think that if you look at the underlying reasons for a lot of this stuff, it is a lack of knowledge and practices, right? It's plain and simple. Whether it's a person, entering the data, or whether it's, the person who set up a device that, a sensor that gathers all the data. I mean, you do what's in front of you, but it's hard to understand the second, third order consequences of that. right? But I think that's the level of thinking that we got to get to, as well as just understanding basic data modeling practices. Again, that's kind of the thing I've been harping on, but that's one thing out of like many things I think that are, from a practice standpoint that we could definitely improve on. So I think that, it's ironic that we live in an age of like endless amounts of data tools and technology and approaches, and we still have a hard time getting the basics right.
I believe that if people focused on the frameworks and these points that you're making, then the tool should always be the next thing. It's downstream. The tool, if you're not fast in using tools or learning tools these days, then you're pretty relevant anyway. So, but don't focus on being an expert in the tool. Focus on the framework. And yes, there's expertise, right? Like clearly there is value to somebody that knows a tool very well. But if you want to really drive change and strategy, and maybe that's a better way to put it, is like, if you want to be the order taker, learn the tool, there's going to be a place for that, clearly. And if you're happy there, you should do it. I'm not here to be the moral police of like what you should or shouldn't do. But I will say that I have seen this progression. I don't know if you've seen it too, Joe, but as an analyst, somebody who's maybe an analytics professional, they start making all of this stuff, they get embedded in the data, they have strong opinions. And over time, you want to see those decisions made from your recommendations. And the less that happens, the more frustrated you get with the field. I see this happen 99% of the time for an analyst's life. And so the question then becomes, well, how do you become the decision maker, which is often not the case for analytics professionals, because it's not its own function. Like it's a cost center function, right? It's not a business decision function. It's not ops. It's not, right. You're hiring for your team. And I think this is what's challenging. Bridging that gap strategically requires the ability to then be assigned to own a product that's customer facing right. And so there's a lot of professionals that struggle to make that jump because they're stuck in this world of they're experts. They're not looking outside the box and saying, let me own this recommendation. Let me own this business decision and let me drive this product and be the product owner, because it's just not, the progression of the career. Do you agree with that?
I think I've seen that a lot. I mean, I was lucky enough early in my career to have somebody who, took a shot on me. And, so my first job, I was working at a company, and in very short order, I'd say within about a month or two, I was sitting outside the CEO's office, and I was giving him all the data he needed, and started becoming, offering advice too, and to the point where, I was directly responsible for outcomes in the business, so it's a very rare opportunity. But I learned early on, sort of tying the data back to business outcomes, very harshly. I wouldn't say harshly, but very, I would say very concretely, right? So yeah, I think it's part of it is just, I think it's the marketing of data teams too, though, right? So and frankly, I'm not sure the function of a lot of data teams these days. I'm sure they do some things, but it's like a lot of companies, I feel like back when I got started in this stuff, it was like there wasn't really a data profession, so to speak, right? Like you were more embedded with certain functions, at least in my experience. I'm sure others will disagree or have different experiences, and that's totally fine. But in my experience, it was definitely data was a sort of a secondary concern. It was more, okay, so you're going to help with sales and marketing. We need to have certain outcomes here. For marketing, we need to make more money and drive sales. Pretty clear, based on the amount of spend we're doing. So make it work, right? So that's I think very concrete actions. But yeah, I don't know. It's I feel like we're definitely kind of sort of at an interesting spot right now with data teams, right? Because I know a lot of them are under evaluation right now, and sort of the being assessed by purse string holders, so hopefully a lot of this changes. I feel like the last 10 years, the 2010s, I think in no small part due to the the excitement around data science really put data at the center of everything, and I think that's fine. We do live in a data first world these days, but I think that the way we integrate data and people, that needs probably a second look. We could do a better job with it for sure. So.
Well, we only have like 5 minutes left. And so let's talk about the social media side, because I think it'd be sad if we didn't. What's driving that interest, and what specifically is on your mind there?
I mean, you got kids, right?
I do.
Yeah, I do too. And I feel like it's interesting. I mean, I hate to sound like an old fart. I grew up in the 80s, which is a lot of fun. You probably did too.
It's a great time.
So my childhood resembled very much like the scene, the Stranger Things show. Minus fighting Demogorgons and stuff. But as I look at my kids today, and I look at their friends and whatever, it's like you have everything at your disposal now. All the media, it's all there. Any game you want is all there. And the universal posture I see around the world is this: it's somebody hunched over on their phone, right? Lord knows I do that as well. But what I see happening right now with kids, and adults, but kids are what I'm focused on, because I feel like adults are kind of a lost cause. We're too old, nothing you can do about it. So, but for kids, I feel like there's a good opportunity to, I don't know, maybe give them something new. And by new, I mean get them out of the house. Take them on hikes, get them experiences that don't involve just chatting with your friends all day. I think as I look at my kids and their friends, I'm concerned. I feel like they're, mental health is a really big thing. Kids, I think, are, they're attaching their self-confidence to, I think some of the wrong things, social media or, those kind of stuff. So it's something that's been on my mind a lot lately, and especially with the rise of AI, it's like, how do you prepare kids for what's probably going to be a much different world than the one that we grew up in? I'm not saying go back to the 80s, but what I'm saying is like, what's not going to change in the face of AI? I think that the types of jobs that we're suggesting kids go to and the way we teach kids, I think does need to change. You're fundamentally seeing a huge shift already with how kids are integrating AI into their lives with respect to education, and the impacts of social media. Again, I think is these are all kind of the parts of the same thread. And so it's something I've been thinking about a lot. Like how do you inspire this generation of kids and younger to to be the best versions of themselves in the face of a very rapidly changing world. So something that's been on my mind a lot. I don't have an answer for it yet.
I appreciate your answer. Like, deliberate parenting is hard. I found that to be true with the 10-year-old, twin 8-year-olds, and a 3-year-old. It's challenging.
Is that the ages of your kids?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
It's challenging, and it pushes you. It pushes the boundaries. The most rewarding thing that I've ever done, but it's also it is the most challenging thing that I've ever done. And there is a concern that I have for default adopt. I've talked a lot about this recently, which is, if you look at technology, we're default adopt. We justify social media. And I think there's a lot of parents that wish that their children had never been on social media. And there's probably lots of stories around this across the world. And that was default adopt. There was a default adopt on I need to have my child on this because they're going to be weird if they're not. There's a lot of people that talk about this. And that is not a good objective function in anything in your life. You like, what should be deliberate. And I think that this is one of the things that I worry about most with my kids. How do you ensure that their decision-making improves because of AI?
Right.
This is a big concern to me. Not the automation. The automation, I'm not concerned about as much. If you have a lawnmower that's automated, that's doing the grass, fantastic. That's great. I can find other tasks for my kids to build character. But the bigger question is if I'm now assuming that the same thing applies to decision-making, I'm wrong. Decision-making is a new paradigm. We haven't had any technology that's automated away decision-making. And an example of this is, of course, the car. You've heard me talk about this, but you take away the skills of decision-making for driving a car from a kid, there's an effect on that. And there's not an easy replacement for that type of skill building.
Mm-hmm. No, you're absolutely right. I feel like we're definitely at an interesting point where we're going to be outsourcing more and more of our critical thinking. But if you lack the context or you lack the critical thinking skills to begin with, that ain't great, right? And I think that's sort of the central concern that I have. I mean, I see this with adults even right now, on LinkedIn, I see people posting things which I'm very much convinced are written by ChatGPT. And I'm like, this doesn't seem like your writing or your voice. But for kids who don't know any better, it's just going to be sort of the default, as you say. And in some contexts, that's fine, but you need to understand that, well, is the output correct or not, right? And that's decision making, that's critical thinking. And so I do this with my kids right now with math story problems. And like, put it in ChatGPT, see what it comes out with. I don't care. You're going to be doing it anyway, right? But then let's go through the answer. Half the time it's wrong. And I'm like, so find out where it's wrong. So what I'm trying to teach my kids is just how to become better BS detectors, right? But they're lucky to have a dad like me who kind of knows this stuff. But a lot of parents don't. So that's the thing I've been thinking about is, for the parents that don't, like how do you teach critical thinking to kids? I feel like the entire way that we've been teaching kids in school, it's been suddenly completely inverted to a large extent, where we, instead of writing essays, I think we need to have different ways of assessing what an essay was supposed to assess, and same with the way we teach math and everything else. I mean, so it's like you're given the answers, but you need to understand if the answers are right or not. And I think that's the skill you're going to have to figure out, because the larger problem is, and the thing that I'm more concerned about is that the proliferation of AI generated content is going to mean just absolute crap in the universe, to the point where it's sort of like the old the Iliad, where you decide to not look at the sirens calling you to crash on the rocks. And I feel like the internet's about to become just like that, where there's going to be so much garbage. Like how do you know what's right or wrong? Right.
It's impossible. Like with publications now, major publications, they don't retract. Right? There's not really that much retraction. So like this is even manually impossible right now, where let's say the major publication, one of the major ones, they don't retract. Well, is it right or wrong? Like you have now created a really big problem manually. AI is not going to improve upon that, right? Like,
it'll just make it worse. Actually,
yeah.
My dad said back in the day, like he's convinced there'll be a point when people will actually opt to leave the internet. More and more, I'm actually starting to believe that he could be correct. I've been thinking about this at some point. It's like, if it becomes too much of a hall of mirrors, I'd rather just sit with a regular book and just read. I mean, Lord knows I have enough of them I can read through. Most of the news doesn't matter to you that you read. Why does it matter to you? You don't need to know what happens. It doesn't affect you. So, so I think it'll be interesting to see what happens. I don't have an answer for this. I don't think anyone does, but we're definitely at a very interesting, again, inflection point with knowledge. And I think, you're into decision making, right? I am too. And I think it's going to be about getting back to basics, but it's going to be hard. It's going to be really hard, because the temptation is to outsource everything. And so, but it's, I feel like AI is sort of the high fructose corn syrup of society.
I love that.
Fat.
I love that term. So, Joe, this has been great. Thanks for being so gracious with your time.
Anytime.
Clearly, anybody that needs to follow Joe, follow him. I'm excited about this course that you're putting out. Excited about learning more about frameworks, the fundamentals of these frameworks, of how to scope, how to build the requirements, all of that. But Joe, thank you so much.
Anytime, Carlos. It's good to see you, man.
Thank you for joining us on the AI Decision Guy podcast. Don't forget to subscribe, rate, and review our show, and be sure to tune in to our future episodes as we continue to explore the ever-evolving landscape of AI and its impact on decision-making. Until next time.